In this lesson, we are going to talk about using MySQL with PHP.
So essentially, we're just going to be combining the two together.
Right, we're going to be taking everything we've learned up to this point and showing how to use both systems together.
All right, cool.
Now, we need to take a look at how we are going to access our MySQL database from within PHP.
Okay.
That means the first thing we'll need to do is have PHP connect to the MySQL server.
Okay.
This is going to bring us to the first of the MySQL PHP functions that we're going to talk about.
All righty.
The first one is MySQL connect. I'm going to type this out and then I'll talk about exactly how it works.
Okay.
The function is MySQL underscore connect, and then you specify a set of arguments. We need to specify the host name, basically the server we're going to be connecting to, the username, and the password.
Essentially that's kind of like the thing you did in MySQL, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's like the same information that we needed to specify to log in using the MySQL monitor.
Okay.
Same idea. We're connecting to a MySQL server.
I see.
So the first is going to be the host, and that is still our DS3 server. Next, we're going to log in using our logging account.
Okay.
And we need to specify the password. Now, the password is given in plain text here.
Okay.
And in a later lesson, before we start on the project, we'll show a better way of storing this, or a way of keeping it out of the way.
I see.
So, we're going to specify our password, which is fleas2 for this database. And then we'll terminate that.
All right.
Now, MySQL Connect is going to it can have two possibilities that it will return. If it succeeds in connecting, it will return a link to a MySQL connection, which can be later used. If it fails, it will return false.
Okay.
Now, this link is very important. Within a PHP script, you can have multiple connections to MySQL servers.
Okay.
This means that we need to be able to keep track of each individual connection to a database.
Alrighty.
So that means we need to store the result of this function. And we are going to store that in the variable $db link. So we'll say db link equals MySQL connect.
Okay.
Now, like I said just a second ago, if MySQL connect fails, it will return false, which means we can now test $db link to see if the database connection succeeded or not.
Okay.
This means we could say if not $db link, then the connection has failed. So we could say something like echo database connection failed, or error connecting to database.
I see.
And also I'm going to exit out. Because our script is going to rely on information from a MySQL database, we want to ensure that we do in fact have a good connection before continuing.
I see, okay.
So, let's save this out and take a look at it, see if it works. I'm going to call this script phpdb.php.
Okay.
We'll go over to our web browser, access the script, and we got nothing.
Right.
Which, in this case, is actually a good thing.
That is a good thing.
That means we never got in here. We must have had something other than false stored in db link.
That's right. So, in other words, a true.
So, what would happen if I had specified some invalid information? How about I give it an account that we do not have in MySQL?
Ooh.
So we see we've got a warning here, and we hit our if statement where it said the database connection has failed.
I gotcha.
And this is good to note. This is the behavior of the MySQL connect function.
All right.
If it fails, it will throw a warning and give some information. Access denied for user 2 and
I see.
all that.
So it's telling you where that it failed at.
Now, even though it does give this warning, it's still a good idea to set up your own if block, because this means we can check and then do something if the database connection has failed.
I gotcha. Okay.
So let's set this back now so we have our working database connection. So, well, that's step 1 complete. We can connect to a MySQL database.
Okay.
Now, remember in the MySQL monitor videos, we saw that we had to select a database before we could start accessing tables and data.
Right.
The same holds true within PHP. You have to select a database before you can begin using it.
Okay.
To do that, we will look at the MySQL select DB function. So we'll say MySQL select DB. Now we need to specify a database name and the connection that we're going to be using for this.
Okay.
So to select, if you remember from the MySQL monitor lesson, we have a database set up called logging. So that is the one we wish to use. So we'll say we're selecting the database logging, and we're going to specify our $db link So we say select the database using this connection.
Okay.
Once again, if we had multiple connections active, we can specify which database we're going to use through each connection.
I see.
And now, in a manner kind of similar to MySQL Connect, the MySQL select DB function will return a value depending on whether or not it worked.
Okay.
Only this time we don't need any reference back to this like we did with an actual link.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just going to return true or false. It will return true if the command succeeded and false if the select failed.
Okay.
Now, I don't need to store that in a variable because I don't want an extra variable just laying around. We want to do this one check and that's it.
Okay.
Once again, it's not like a link. We're not going to refer to it later. So I'm simply going to put this entire function within an if statement and run it or evaluate it as an expression.
Okay.
So we can say if we have selected logging, do this. Actually, I want to check for failed, so we'll do the same as with the link. I'm going to add the not operator.
Okay.
So we'll see if the MySQL select DB has failed. If so, we'll say echo error select error selecting database.
All right.
And same. Since we can't proceed if we don't have a database selected, I'm going to have it exit out.
Okay.
So let's save this, run it, and once again nothing. It looks
All
like
right,
we've
cool.
gotten
That's
through
good.
that. So just to prove, like before, let's specify a database that doesn't exist. Let's attempt to select logging Z.
Okay.
And it still seems to be working. That's interesting. Let's take a look at what's going on. Echo error selecting database. I just forgot to
let's see that.
Yep,
Yeah.
save thing is important.
Very important.
Error selecting database.
Cool.
So let's put this back and run. Now we're back in business.
All right, cool.
So we have connected to a database. We have selected a database. Now let's take a look at what we need to do to run queries. Now that we have a database selected for use, we can start working with tables and running queries.
Yeah.
So this brings us to the MySQL query function.
Okay.
MySQL query is used to run a query using a specific database link and return a result that can be used to look through any records that that query returned.
Okay.
So let's take a look at this. The syntax is MySQL query, and then we specify the query and the database link. Now for the query, I'm actually going to store this in a separate variable to make it a little easier to work with. So I'm actually going to write down $query and then $db link, like such. So now we need to define $query. So I'll say that $query is equal to some string. And let's do something simple. If you remember from the MySQL lesson, we created a small table called test. Let's load some data out of that.
Okay.
So let's select all fields from test.
All right. And of course, asterisk being wildcard.
Exactly, meaning we're going to grab
everything.
Grab all fields, and then we are omitting a where clause, which means grab every single record available.
Okay.
So we'll run this query. Now, like I was saying, MySQL query also returns a result. And its actual return type is dependent on the type of query you run. If you run a select, then the two possible return types are false, if the query failed, or a resource identifier, meaning a type of result that can contain other data.
Okay.
Basically, it's the type of result that would contain the MySQL records that we can look through.
I see.
So this means that, like with the DB link, we're going to need to store this in some variable so we can refer to it later. So we'll say that $result equals MySQL query. So we store the result of this in $result. Now, once again, we can test this because if the query fails, it will return false. One other note, when I was talking about the differences between what type of query you run, a select can return false on failure, or it can return some information if it succeeded. Other types of queries that do not return records, like updates and deletes, will simply return true or false. If it worked, it will return true. If it failed, it will return false.
Okay.
So either way, you can use $result to see if the query executed successfully. So we'll set up a block to test this. So we'll say if not $result. So if the query has failed, we will echo. For now, we'll echo query failed, just something simple. And let's save this out and see where we're at.
Okay.
So if we run this, Once again, blank, which means so far
So good.
all our code is working. So what if we messed some of this up? Let's make a table that doesn't exist. Test Z. And we run. Query failed. Now, if you remember back to the MySQL monitor, we got a more detailed description of what went wrong. It gives us an error message and tries to help us out with where in the syntax it went wrong.
Right.
That can be useful. If you're working in PHP, it might be handy to be able to bring that up so that you can see what went wrong as opposed to just a generic query failed.
I gotcha.
This will introduce the MySQL error function.
Okay.
So we see that we can tell if an error went wrong. Let's show what that error was. So instead of saying something generic like query failed, we could echo out MySQL error and specify empty parentheses because this is a function. So what MySQL error does is it simply returns the last error that was run from the given connection. So let's run this. Table logging test underscore Z doesn't exist. So that's what went wrong. So just something to keep in mind. If you need to debug your script, then the MySQL error function can be very handy.
I see.
Let's put this back into place, retest one last time, and all is good.
There you go.
So we've worked our way through quite a few things, but we're still not looking at data.
Right.
We need to now take a look at how we work with that $result. How do we get information out of that?
Right.
The first way that we can do that is by using the MySQL result function. So let's take a look at that. MySQL result, and it takes in three things. It takes in the resource ID, which we can use result. It takes in the actual row of the result, because if you remember a query, or when you run a select, you can get multiple rows back at once. So we need to specify exactly which row we want to return from. And finally, we need to specify which field that we want to look at. So let's plug some of this information in. We'll give it $result. Let's say we want to look at row 0.
Okay.
And with MySQL result, rows are 0 based. So the very first row in the list is going to be 0.
0, I see.
Now which field? Let's take a look at the username field. And end this off. Now by itself, all MySQL result does is return the information. It doesn't do anything with it. So we're going to use echo to output that information.
And look at that.
And check it out.
Cool.
So that was the first result. Let's see if there's any others. Let's see if we can advance this to 1. And we can.
There you go. So what would happen if you try to get a result that's not there?
If you try to go past, let's say, grab a next record.
And warning.
MySQL result will throw a warning saying that there was no row 2 in the MySQL result.
I gotcha. Okay.
So yes, it will throw warnings if you attempt to access information that is not there.
I gotcha.
It's a good point to notice because other methods often don't throw this type of warning. Now, so far we've taken a look at different rows. What if we wanted to look at a different field? Let's set this back to 0. Let's go back to the first one. And now let's look at the auto ID field. And we can, in fact, access that. So we can access any field from a specified row within a MySQL result.
I see.
Now, another way of looking at this is you can say that the row specifies which row you're on, and the field could be looked at as the column. So it's almost like specifying a coordinate within a grid of data.
I see. Okay.
For a visual representation of this, let's bring up the old MySQL monitor that we were running in from previous lessons. We can see that this would be a visual representation of the data we're working with. This is the same query we ran, select star from test.
I see.
You can see we have auto ID and username.
Okay.
The very first field, or the very first row 0, would be this, and row 1 would be this.
So I can see how that would, come back to haunt you if you tried to, because people looking at it would just say that's row 1 and row 2. So they would be one off every time.
You do need to remember that the rows are 0 based.
Also, I have seen this happen before. Don't get confused by the auto ID being the row also.
Yes, that's a good point. Rows will always start at 0. The auto ID itself is actually a field. It is data contained within the table, not a number of one of the rows.
I gotcha.
So once again, going back to the MySQL result, we see we can specify row 0, row 1, and then field auto ID or username, and that's how we're able to access one element from this grid of data.
I gotcha.
So with that, that's basically how you can go about extracting individual pieces of data.
Okay.
Let's take a look at something else that is very useful, and that is the ability to show how many rows are in a given result.
I see.
Since we found that we could access row 0, row 1, so we had multiple rows of data, but the moment we tried to access an invalid one, we get a warning.
Exactly.
So how do we go about knowing how much data is there so we don't access something invalid?
Exactly.
This will introduce the MySQL result function. I mean, excuse me, the MySQL num rows.
I got you.
Sorry, you're confused.
Yeah.
MySQL num rows will return how many rows of data were within a given result.
Okay.
So let's say we were to echo MySQL num rows for $result. And let me append an HTML line break to make this a little bit more readable. Let's see. And with that, we'll run.
And 4.
And just to separate this a little bit, we'll add rows after the end of that.
And 2 rows. There you go.
Okay, now I'm being picky.
Yeah. There you go.
So we see we have 2 rows within $result. So in that way we know that once we go above, so we have 0, we have 1, there's our 2 rows. If we go above that, then we're going to get an error.
There you go.
Another thing this allows us to do, now that we know how many rows there are, we could actually build a loop within PHP to go and walk through all of the data within a MySQL result.
Okay.
So let's take a look at doing that.
All right.
Let's start a for loop. And let's give ourselves $I for our iteration counter. Let's set it to 0 to start out with, just like before.
Okay.
Then we'll say that we'll keep looping as long as $I is less than MySQL num rows for our given result.
I gotcha.
This will allow us to continue looping until we hit the end and not exceed that last row.
I gotcha. Okay.
And of course, we'll increment I each iteration.
So it'll keep going until there's nothing else to go on to.
Exactly. So I'm moving this one line that had our MySQL result, moving that into the for loop.
Okay.
And at the end of it, let me add an HTML line break, just so that all these are on their own line. So, look good?
Yeah.
All right, let's take a look at it.
4.
Actually, let me change this to the username.
Oh, I see. So it's giving us the auto ID. So.
Right.
And there. Hey, look, it's me twice.
That's interesting. We got 2 rows of information printed, but they're the same.
What? How come that happened?
If you look at the line that we were using, it still had our hard-coded 0 in place.
Oh, I see.
So
it kept looking at the same row.
So we looped for the correct number of times, 2, but we specified the same row each time.
I see.
Instead of specifying 0, let's give it our index counter.
So if we had, tried to do it with 50 rows, you'd have 50 of my name.
Exactly.
I gotcha.
So let's replace that hard-coded 0 with the variable $I, which starts at 0 and should continue incrementing, which will then give us both rows in the table. So, excellent. Now we have a loop that can walk through all data within a result. So now we're starting to get into some more powerful code.
I see.
As we can have very dynamic pages based directly off of database information.
Pretty handy, too.
So, that covers the use of MySQL result, MySQL num rows, and using both of them together to loop. Now, let's take a look at a different method of extracting data from a MySQL result. Let's take all of this and clear it out. That was fun.
Okay.
But let's take a look at a different way that this can be done. Often convenient as almost like a form of shorthand for accessing data.
I see. So you're just going to condense all that down?
Somewhat, actually.
Okay.
We're going to look at the MySQL fetch associative function.
Okay.
I'll type out the syntax and then I'll explain it. So you have MySQL fetch ASSOC. And it takes in just one argument, $result. Now what this does is it returns an array. So I'm going to go ahead and store this in a variable. So we'll say that we have a $row that returns, or that holds the information returned from MySQL fetch associative.
Okay.
Now, as I was saying, $row contains an array. Let's show that. Let's var dump $row and prove that it is in fact an array.
Okay.
So we'll save that, run,
There we
and
go.
check it out. $row is an array, and with an array with 2 elements.
Okay.
It has a key called AutoID, which contains the string 4. It has a second key called username, which contains the string 5.
I see.
I mean, excuse me, the string length of 5.
String. Terry.
Just make sure everyone's awake.
Yep.
So, this is interesting. What this means is we've created an associative array, meaning we have a text-based key to point to some data. And though the interesting thing with this is it returns rows one at a time.
Okay.
Even though this was a 2-element array, the reason it had 2 elements is because we have 2 fields within our table.
Okay.
So basically we're given an element for AutoID.
Okay.
Then we're giving another element for username.
Okay.
This AutoID and username belong to the same row. The first row, actually, because this is the first time that we have run the function.
Right.
Now, here's another interesting behavior. That's already kind of cool that we can take an array and access individual elements. Now that we've proven it's an array, let's show using it in a more common fashion, extracting just one of the fields for output. So we'll say we want to echo out the username. We would do that by saying echo $row, and then specifying the username key. So we'll specify the username key, like such. And now we're printing out just Terry.
Look at that.
So that's cool and all, but what if we wanted to access more than one row? This brings us to an interesting behavior with the MySQL fetch associative. Now, within a result, the result actually holds an internal location. Basically, it remembers what row it was last at.
Okay.
And MySQL fetch associative advances that position within result every time it is used.
Okay.
So let's prove that. Let's just copy this code and directly paste it.
All right.
You would think that this would print Terry twice, because it's the exact same code.
Exact same thing.
Let me add the line break so that these are on their own separate line.
Okay.
So that would be the expected behavior, that we have Terry printed twice. But we don't.
It says Terry Logan. Why did that happen?
Like I was saying with the internal location, $result remembers what row it is currently on. Fetch associative advances that. So if we use it once, after using it, it has internally moved on to the next record.
I see.
If we use it again, we're now looking at the next record, and we continue advancing.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying.
So, what do you think would happen if we run it 3 times?
The third time, when there's nothing there?
I mean, last time we tried to access past, there was an error.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. We're going to give us an error.
Let's run it. Nothing. It
absolutely still says Terry Logan.
So, that's interesting. Let's see if there's anything in $row. Let's var dump $row again.
Okay.
Ooh,
false statement.
So $row is now a Boolean false.
I gotcha.
What this does is this allows us to check when we have hit the end of our result. Basically, we've hit the last element.
I gotcha.
So, this, and of course it doesn't give us the error, which is nice in a way. That means your script won't throw errors if you try to access invalid elements. But it does mean you have to be careful, because if you're expecting this to work, because all this is valid code, and wondering why you're not getting a value, you have to keep in mind that the result is going to remember where it is at internally.
Okay.
But here's another interesting thing. It returns false when we're at the last record. This means that this method would be well suited for use in a while loop. So let's take a look at using this method, the MySQL fetch associative with $row, in a while loop.
Okay.
So we'll say while $row is equal to, so we'll just copy this out exactly. Except we have to remove the terminator and then add the parenthesis. So let's make a while loop. And the reason that this works, this is kind of funny. It looks like while we can set row to result, we have to remember that this is going to become false once we hit the end.
I see.
Basically, if we were to say, all right, set row to equal the result of fetch associative, and this returns something, return an array. An array is something other than false, and that means we will continue looping. However, we hit the end, then row is set to false, which will cause the while loop to stop, or to end.
All right, that makes sense.
So let's erase some of this and copy this line, put it within the while block, and now we're done with this code. So let's take a look. Terry and Logan.
Look at that.
So we just condensed that entire block of
You
code
just cleaned up a lot
into one convenient while loop.
Yeah.
So, and in this way we get the convenience of being able to use an associative array where we specify the field in the key and get the value back, so that's convenient. And the while loop gives us a very simple way of walking through all results.
Yeah, and also it makes your code a lot cleaner too.
Yeah, most definitely. Now, here's one last thing to remember when using something that affects where $result is within its internal rows of data. Let's say we wanted to duplicate this entire thing. We want to make a copy of this entire while loop. And I'm going to echo some line breaks in between just so we can separate the two. So what would you think this should do? Copying the code that echoes 2 rows, if we ran it again, what would be the expected result?
Well, judging by what you've shown me in the past, I really have no idea anymore what's going to happen.
I guess it is right. Every single time I set you up so that... all right,
for failure.
But it would stand to reason that if this produces 2 lines, Terry and Logan, running it again would produce the same 2 lines.
Right, it should.
And it doesn't. So if we look at what's going on, here's what's happened. We know that once we hit the end of result, row is false.
Right.
It stays false. It does not loop back around and start over at the beginning.
Okay.
Once it hits the end, it stays at the end. And if we try to loop again, it's still going to return false.
Yeah, it's going to keep telling you there's still nothing there.
So now we need to take a look at exactly how do we tell $result to go back to the beginning.
Okay.
This will introduce the MySQL data seek function. MySQL data seek takes in 2 arguments. We specified the row which we wish to seek to, and the connection that we're going to be using to perform, or excuse me, not the connection, the result. We're working on, just like with all these, we're working with the result. We need to specify that we're resetting this result specifically. Once again, just like with connections, we can have as many results as we want. We could have run 3 separate independent queries and stored 3 different results. So down here, of course, we're going to have to specify which result we're working on. So what we want to do here is go back to the very beginning. So we want to go to row 0. Once again, just like specifying 0 with the MySQL result function.
Okay, I see.
And we need to specify that $result is what we're resetting, like such. So now let's run.
Warning.
This is not a valid resource. Did I retype or mistype something? MySQL data seek. $result. Wait a second here. I got the operands mixed up.
Oh, okay, well that should be something to note also, is that it is very important the direction in which you type it.
Yes, in functions in general, the arguments are expected in a very specific order.
Okay.
And things can get very unhappy if that isn't followed. So let's try this. In the case of MySQL data seek, we specify the result before the row which we are going to seek to.
Okay. Oh,
and there we go.
Again.
Now, since we are allowed to specify a row here, we can seek wherever we want it within. So if we were to seek to row 1...
there you go, Terry Logan, space Logan. Okay.
So that's that covers 2 different ways in which we can go about accessing data.
Okay.
So really, that's what we needed to cover in this lesson. Exactly how we go about working with data from inside of PHP. We covered things like connecting to a database from PHP, selecting a database, running queries, looking at the results. We talked about getting the number of rows within the result so we could drive a loop. Then we looked at the MySQL fetch associative so we could build an array that held basically an indexed or a keyed access to our data, so we can specify which field we want to get data from. And finally, we took a look at exactly how the result works with this type of associative fetching, meaning the internal data list and which row we're on within that list.
Okay.
And we saw how we could use that to drive a while loop. And finally, we looked at MySQL data seek so that if we wanted to change or reset the current row of a result, we could do that.
I gotcha.
So that is going to wrap up this lesson.
Okay.